is the PDF for the presentation that we're doing. And I believe that David will also be posting a link to the due diligence checklist. So to kind of go along with, hey, doing deals properly, one of the bigger things in that is due diligence. What do you look for in the practice that you're looking for to buy, or sellers, what are you looking for in terms of a buyer? We've kind of put that all together in a due diligence checklist on things that we see get asked frequently there and back. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So the industry, as you've probably all heard, whether it's investment news or other particular articles, is getting older. So I think I've seen that the average age of an advisor in this industry is anywhere from, I think I've seen 51 at the youngest, 57 at the oldest, but let's just call it 53, 54, somewhere in the middle there. And if you couple that with the average age of a seller, so the average age of a seller in our industry, and it's been probably about 10 years running, the average age of a seller is about 62. And that's been on average across the board for the last 10 years have been similar, 61, 63, in that range. Now, there's always going to be advisors that die at their desk, don't ever sell, so they're not going to raise the average up. But a lot of them start to hit that age. And if we look around, and what the industry pundits keep talking about is the baby boomers. So as they start hitting this retirement age, are we going to see this flood of sellers that join in the market? So some of the stuff that we're going to talk about is going to piggyback on that concept. But the idea is that trying to get, mistakes across the board. Every buyer and every deal, there are always mistakes. Even myself, even though I've done almost 1,000 deals now, there are still things that pop up that will be like, oh, we got to remember to do that piece. So we've put together 5 of those potential hiccups here. And the idea is that if we can get these into your head now, maybe you won't make these ones. There's certainly probably something that's going to pop up that wasn't seen on the horizon here, but at least maybe you won't have to make these mistakes on your own to learn them. So that's the idea. But the going forward, conceptually here, we should be having far more deals going forward in the next 10 years than we would in the past 10 years. So this is a very poignant topic. It should apply to pretty much everybody in the industry, whether you're looking to grow buyer side or whether you're looking to eventually get out of this business in the next few years. Sell side, this should have some applicability to you. So again, as we go through this, if you have questions, please put them in that chat box. We'd love to get all of those questions answered, hammered out for you. So first piece is my ugly mug. So we've got, my name's Erik Pahlow. I am a partner here at Succession Resource Group. Kind of background is that I've been doing this since about 2001, seen almost 1,000 deals now, done over 5,000 valuations. So it's kind of where we're going to be pulling this data from and this experience from. And then obviously, if you get a chance, LinkedIn me, be happy to connect through there as well. But Succession Resource Group is a succession planning firm. So we do everything from valuations to contingency plans, helping with entity support, buying businesses, offer letters, selling businesses, all kinds of things. So basically anything on that wheel that you see in front of you, we can help with. So I'll say a little bit more about how we can do that at the back end for the little sales pitch piece. But at the beginning, let's just go ahead and jump into common mistakes that we see in a deal that hinder you, hold you up, sometimes blow the deal altogether. And so we'll look at this both from buyer side and seller side because they'll both be applicable. So mistake number 1 is understanding the motivations of the seller. And the biggest mistake is you don't understand them. Either from the seller side, the real driving force behind why you're actually looking to do this, or from the buyer side, not understanding what is popping up or why the seller's wanting to do it, is really going to be a hindrance in you speaking to those particular topics and actually getting to the finish line. So the biggest piece in that is emotions. Most sellers that I have seen financially are ready well before they are emotionally. Now you think about this industry, we've probably had our clients for 10, 20, 30 years sometimes, and we have developed that business, an independent business that is our baby, and it has become almost a part of our identity, who we are, right? So how we go about our daily life, how we talk in the club or the gym, everything is kind of built around what we do. And it is very difficult for most to let that go, right? And so across the board, we ended up with emotions blocking our actual pulling the trigger. So a lot of sellers you will see have been coasting for 3, 4, 5 years because financially they were probably ready, but the question in their head was, what am I going to go do with my time, right? And you'll see this on the next slide on what am I going to go do with my time. But the emotion piece, how do I let go? How do I not be in that particular role? Understanding that both from the seller side so you can come to grips with it, but also the buyer side, what are they dealing with, is really one of the things you kind of need to understand. What are they going through? And if you do, then you'll be able to speak to it and continue forward through that deal. The next one under not understanding sellers' motivations is the post-closing role. So every seller is going to, unless there's a death, is going to stick around in some capacity to transition clients. Now, sometimes that capacity is, hey, I'm staying for 3 months to a year in a just transition basis to help transition the clients and introduce them. And sometimes that's, hey, I'm going to stay as a rainmaker. I'll do the consulting on the front end, then I'll stay, and if I bring new clients in, I'll get something for that. Or even more so, some of them will stick around and be an employee in a reduced capacity. Now, that is a step-down process where they might work for 3, 4, 5 years across the board, and I could talk more of that about that at length later. But for the most part, you need to know what is it that the seller is actually trying to accomplish, and what do they want their involvement post-closing to be. So if you write an offer, as an example, from a buyer side that says, hey, we'll retain you for 6 months to a year to transition the clients, but the seller really wants to have, maybe I stick around for 20 hours a week and I help service my top clients, as an example, for the next 3 years, you're not really speaking to what is motivating them from that standpoint. So understanding that is going to help you write a better offer and meld that offer to what the seller is actually looking for. And the last one in the not understanding sellers' motivations is, what does the ideal transition look like? So when you sit down together on let's say an initial conversation, whether you're on the seller side or whether you're the buyer side, and this is one of the things we do when we negotiate for sellers, we sit down and say, what does it look like? Ideal scenario. And they will usually start describing what it is that they're looking for in a buyer, what it is or what kind of pitch do they want to give to their clients on why they're doing this, and what their motivations are. So when you figure out that ideal transition, timing, what it may look like, how they position this to the clients, then everything you do from that point forward can all be looking towards tying it back to that motivation or that ideal. Right, so whether it's the transition timeline, the closing date, whether the offer's coming in, what role they have, everything is under that ideal transition. So asking that question on the front end will save you a lot of time. I know we have a good example on this understanding motivations across the board. One of them lately, there was a seller that didn't quite realize that this was the main issue, but they were really looking for an after-tax dollar number of like 500 grand. And so the buyer didn't know that, didn't have any idea, and the seller hadn't told them in any way, but the buyer kept writing offers, and they'd raise the price tag a little bit and tweak the terms and do this and that with the taxes, and we'll talk about that in a second. But every offer they put in would be close to the 500K after tax, but didn't quite hit it. So this particular seller just kept, no, that doesn't work, that doesn't work, that doesn't work. And then as soon as they figured it out, and the buyer asked enough questions, said, okay, really, what are you looking for in this transition? And what are you looking for in this particular offer? They let it out. Said, okay, I want 500K after taxes. Boom, buyer instantly able to change the offer on the price, the terms, the taxes, to make it so that 500K comes out after taxes and the seller accepted it right away. So just asking those questions on the front end are going to make a lot of difference in terms of how you actually get to the finish line. Mistake number 2, and this is a big one, is being, I don't want to say uneducated, but this is a very competitive space. So since the day I jumped into the industry, it has been a seller's market. That may change if all the baby boomers choose to retire at the same time. But right now, it's a seller's market. And in doing so, if you go in with a notion that it's a certain multiple, or terms are typically this particular way, or the tax elements are usually done this way, or you haven't ferreted out lending, those are usually going to hinder you big time on being able to get to the finish line. So I still see and hear from advisors, oh, the average is 2 times recurring revenue. Well, when I got in the industry in 2001, the average was 2.1 times recurring revenue. And it's just risen since then. The average for me last year was 2.62. So if you're still stuck on some of those, you're just going to be squeezed out on the price, terms. What are the lenders doing? The lender options change every year on what they can do. So you can even get 100% financing now across the board. You basically bring $0 to the table, and you can borrow all of the money for the deal. And there's all kinds of ways to do that. But the more you understand those terms, how they work, how the taxes impact the price or terms, the more educated you are, the better off you're going to be able to figure out, in mistake number 1, what are the motivations, what's the seller looking for, and using number 2, being super educated on how all of those affect each other to make the cash flow work for you. So one of the phrases I always like to say is, cash flow is king, but the future is brighter. And that sounds kind of funny, but I am so used to industry pundits being cash flow, cash flow, cash flow, cash flow, cash flow. And they're right. You definitely need to pay attention to cash flow. You have to look at what the bottom line is going to be. But I think that so many of them look so closely to cash flow that they don't think about the long-term investment here. So if you think about that, right, you might have really tight cash flow if you pay a premium price on a business in the first couple of years. But if you're planning to have that business for 20, 30 years, what do you think the return on your investment is going to be? Yeah, maybe eat some ramen on year 1. But don't lose sight of the end goal is you growing at that certain clip and you having that cash flow stream for the next 20, 30 years. That is going to make way more of a difference than being tight on cash flow up front. And that's the piece that sometimes is lost, is the long-term aspects of it. Pretty much if you ask any buyer in general, there's probably exceptions to every rule, but in general, you ask every buyer, would you do it again? And all of them say yes. Why? Because the cash flow long-term looks fantastic. Might be tight early, but the long-term investment here is probably one of the best investments they're going to possibly make across the board. Mistake number 3, if you're an attorney on here, you're probably not going to like what I'm saying, but don't let counsel run you. So many times I get a call from somebody saying, hey, this is where we're at. We've been talking for a while. My attorney's saying this, their attorney's saying this. And that, unfortunately, is going to cause you to be less likely to get your deal done. Attorneys are not paid to get the deal to the finish line. They're paid to get the deal in your favor. And what typically happens is there's an attorney on one side, so the other side ends up getting an attorney, and then they have their pissing contest on how they can negotiate and get through everything, and you're more likely for it to be adversarial versus you guys actually working together. So the ideal here is don't let them run you. You and the seller, or seller and the buyer, sit down. What do you guys think this should look like? What do you want to have in there? Then you take it to your attorneys, or you have SRG do it, and put all the purchase agreements together more from this is what we want in there. And you are controlling the process versus the other way. If it's the other way, you are far less likely to actually get to the finish line. You get hurt feelings. Sometimes you can't ever come to a conclusion on certain aspects of a negotiation. So that piece is a very frequent one that I see blow deals up. Mistake number 4, bad contracts. So contracts in general, and you probably all know this, right? Contracts are there in case the worst case scenarios happen, right? If everything goes great, could have done it on a napkin. Big deal, right? Nothing actually came up that was an issue. But frequently, we see great purchase agreements, phenomenal purchase agreements for a coffee shop, not for a highly regulated FINRA business or SEC business, right? And there are certain rules, regs that are specific to our industry that you wouldn't have to deal with in another industry. So they need to be industry specific. They've got to be able to cover, ERISA rules, SEC rules, so on and so forth. And there might be BD rules or custodial things that you need to pop in there as well. But also, we frequently see missed stuff, things that should be in the contracts that aren't. And the biggest one, oftentimes one of the things that I'll see, and this is a good example, I had a guy the other day that called me. They're 2 years into their deal, and they found out that the seller is treating the tax treatment one way and the buyer is treating the tax treatment a different way. And they've been writing it off and doing their taxes in a different manner, and now they're being audited because they didn't actually do the tax forms the right way, and they've been treating it in a different way. And so they came to me and said, okay, how do we fix this? And I'm looking at the purchase agreements, and there is nothing about taxes in the purchase agreement at all. It doesn't say. Says, hey, I'm buying all these assets, but it doesn't specify what value am I placing to each of those assets. So in that circumstance, pretty much the IRS is going to dictate it for them. And they're probably going to have to go back and amend what they have done for the last 2 years because they didn't put it in the purchase agreement. So missed items, frequent. The other piece is the stock versus asset. So a lot of industries, they do stock sales, right? So you buy the entity, the grocery store, the infrastructure, everything else. Our space, not very frequent that we do stock, right? So most of ours are asset sales. We're not buying liabilities. We're buying relationships that an advisor has with clients. And so that concept is not necessarily taken into account very well in like a LegalZoom set of contracts, as an example. So while that might be cheaper, it probably doesn't help you in the end. Good example, I'm going to use Ameriprise as a good example. So Ameriprise was tired of getting purchase agreements that really didn't have anything that was industry specific. So they had their attorneys put together a 50-page primer just to educate an attorney on what needed to actually be included into a purchase agreement in our space. So if the primer is 50 pages long, you can attest to what the purchase agreements probably are going to look like when they're all said and done, and how much you're going to pay to do it. So bad contracts, make sure they're industry specific. Make sure you cover all the items that you need to, and you probably don't even know those at this point. And determine whether you're doing stock and asset. And that can go into a whole different world when we're talking stock versus asset sales, and the tax treatment associated with it. Mistake number 5. So the transition game plan. So this kind of ties into that one, what's that ideal transition look like? But this is one of the pieces that as people get going, buyer and seller, and talking to each other, hey, this is what we're doing, and they're negotiating the deal across the board, and then they get close to the finish line, and they're like, oh, how are we actually going to transition or do the handoff? And they have, because they're so knee-deep into the actual mechanics of the deal and negotiating it and getting the purchase agreements correct, that they hadn't been thinking about the post-closing piece. So make sure you have a post-closing game plan. There's going to be differences here. So whether you bought the stock of like an RIA versus it's a BD, is it a BD change? So you might have paperwork that needs to get done with clients. You might have letters that would go out to clients that are negative consent forms. You may have letters that go out to clients that say, hey, I've always planned for your financial lifetime, not mine. Part of that process is making sure I've got somebody here as I head to retirement, or if I get ran over by a bus. I've gone through an exhaustive search. I think buyer is a perfect fit philosophically in how they do business. Let me introduce you to them. We're going to be working together over the next year. La-di-da, here's, come in and get a meeting. And how do you want to follow up with that letter? Is that phone calls? Is that by the advisors? Is that by some staff to try to get appointments? How does the client meetings look like? All of that mechanics, you should lay that out up front. So the more you do lay that out up front, it's just going to be an easier process. Now, a lot of BDs and custodians will help and have some solutions and helpful pieces for that. But making sure you've got that button down, you definitely want to have what letter are you going to send out, how everything's going to work well in advance, because then it'll just be smoother, because then you can have closing date and boom, letter goes out, or whatever you need to have them sign goes out right then and there. Obviously easier if it's same BD, right? BD to BD, it's going to be a piece of cake. Block transfer, but there may even be transfer forms that you have to fill out with, depending on what BD you've got. How do you notify the particular broker dealer to change the rep ID number? All of that stuff should be buttoned down. So recap. So seller's motivations. Make sure that you understand exactly what they're looking to do. What are they going to spend their time doing afterwards? What's that post-closing look like? And what are their emotions across the board with it? And then that last piece, what's the ideal transition look like? Educate yourself as much as you possibly can on how deals are working, what the average multiples are out there, what's the ranges of those, how does the tax elements affect the deal, terms, what lending do you have out there. The more educated you get, the more you get to drive the boat in terms of negotiations, and you can meld yourself depending on what those seller motivations, number one, would look like. Don't let counsel run you, less likely to get the finish line. Make sure that your contracts are buttoned down pretty well across the board, and make sure you've got a transition game plan of how are you going to communicate with clients and everything else. Now, some best practices, we thought we'd put these up there. These are things that can actually help you out quite a bit as you go through things. Hire a consultant to walk you through the process. If you've got somebody, SRG can do this, but if you've got somebody that has been through it before that can say, these are the pitfalls that are going to be there, that's going to help. Valuation, whether you're seller side or buy side, if you're going to use lending, you're probably going to need an appraisal or valuation of your business in order to get the lending across the board. So the more you have done that in advance, the better. One of the most frequent kept expenses in a deal is employees. So how you pay them, what you pay them, buttoning that down with employment contracts, so on and so forth, will help you out. And hire somebody who actually knows the industry to do the contracts. So across the board, here are a few things that, reasons and ideas that SRG can help with, and some costs associated with those. And then what we want to jump over to, the compliance, obviously we can't help with that, but valuations, employment team resources, contract packages, so we can do the contracts, we can do offer letters, and we can even advocate on behalf of a seller from that standpoint. Now, David wanted me to put this back up there. Obviously the due diligence checklist, so that'll help you in terms of a deal, whether you're buyer and seller. So make sure you take that, that's free. Across the board, and there is our social media stuff, and here is our contact information. So we do have a few questions that have popped up, and I wanted to make sure that we had some time here for these questions. So first one, you mentioned that there are elements that are typically missed in a purchase agreement. What's the most common element missed? Good question. I think the most common one that I see missed is the taxes. All right, so if you go through somebody like me that typically does this industry, and this is all we do, then we'll have tax addendums, we'll have tax forms and everything else in there. But attorneys, oftentimes, they're not tax attorneys, right? So they're oftentimes contract attorneys or a securities attorney, or they're an ERISA attorney, or maybe they're just a general business attorney from that standpoint. So oftentimes they miss the tax elements. Because they're used to doing maybe a stock sale, right? So a stock sale is going to be easy. It's long-term capital gains above the basis for the seller, and for the buyer, you just got basis, right? So there's not a lot that they have to deal with in the stock. In ours, because we've got asset sales typically, and because we have kind of a unique set of things that we are selling, it tends to be the most commonly missed one. So typically, you sell personal goodwill, that's relationships with clients. You sell a restrictive covenant agreement, so some type of non-compete so that the seller doesn't start up next door after you pay them, and some type of consulting agreement, kind of that post-closing thing we were talking about. So all three of those, if you go back to even the 1990s, all of the multiples you've heard, whether it's an EBITDA multiple, an EBOC multiple, a gross multiple, have all been inclusive of all three of those aspects, right? The personal goodwill, the consulting, the non-compete. Now, obviously, a deaf scenario, you wouldn't have the non-compete and you wouldn't have the consulting. But in willing sale scenarios, you wouldn't necessarily, you're going to have all three of those. So that price tag is usually inclusive of all three. So you need to have an allocation of those purchase price for each of those. Now, there's also a tax form you have to fill out for the buying of assets and for the sale of assets across the board. So there's all kinds of things in the tax element that would get missed. Now, there's also, I typically see reps and warranties be different from one industry to another, and so do they know what to put there? Are there transfer forms in terms of the documents that need to be transferred back and forth? So there's all kinds of things that I will see get missed, but taxes is pretty typical one that I see. Next question, when purchasing a practice from a seller, whether their BD is a protocol firm versus non-proto, how do you feel that would affect the multiples for valuation? Okay, so in the independent space, pretty much everybody's a protocol firm. And most of them, even if they didn't sign up for protocol, it depends on privacy policy with clients, but I do not see that aspect affect the price tags much. Now, from what, like captive, right? Let's say wirehouse side of the fence over to an independent side of the fence. There's definitely a different element there, right? So you see the Morgan Stanleys getting out of protocol as an example. And for those of you who maybe don't know what protocol is, it was a set of guidelines that were set that allowed you to take client name, phone number, email address, account type with you as you transitioned to a different firm. And so it made it smoother so that they couldn't necessarily sue you if you did everything correct. So typically in terms of transition rates, if you're going from a wirehouse to an independent, it really depends a lot on what that wirehouse setup looks like. Are they cross-sold and have all their banking there, and they have their trust administration there, and all of that jazz can tie them more than anything else. If you don't have all of that, I don't really see a whole lot of different in the transition rates. Multiples are usually relatively close, right? So whether you're independent to independent or a wirehouse one, typically what they do is they take the wirehouse one, moves independent, so that they can actually have 1 year of owning the business before they sell it, and therefore they can get long-term capital gains. And you basically use a similar multiple to everything that is actually transitioned over. So while you might transition a little less, the multiples are going to be pretty close. Now, average multiple for recurring was 2.62 last year. Now, remember, that's after haircut. So if you're under BD, it's after haircut. And that's been pretty consistent. So the previous 2 years were about 2.6 averages. Non-recurring or transactional revenue is about 0.9 as an average. So remember, those are after haircut numbers, and that's a little like me saying the average price per square foot of a home sold in the United States is $100 a square foot. Might be a true statement. Probably has zero applicability to the business you're looking at, right? So some are going to be much higher, some are going to be much lower. I don't believe I've seen one go below 2 on the recurring side in a few years, and on the high side, we'll always see a few that are over 3. Now, and there's a lot that goes into that. Next question, what is included in turnkey deal support? Does this include closing documents? Yes, so deal support from us, we flat fee it. So I think you saw on that previous slide, it was $71.50. But basically, you'd have me, because I'd run the transaction department here. But you'd have me kind of walking you through the transition. So when you guys came in, buyer seller, most of the time buyer and seller hire us together, and therefore we're kind of a mediator, neutral third party in the middle. I'm not trying to skew it in one way or another. I'm telling you, here's what you can do, here's what you can't do, here's what we have seen done before, here are options, and kind of walking you and guiding you through the process. That does include all of the purchase agreements. So we would actually put together all the purchase agreements. So the asset or stock purchase agreement, any personal guarantees, tax addendums, tax form will usually be in there, restrictive covenants, promissory notes, earnouts, security agreements, whatever may need to be in there, we will take care of all that stuff. So it is actually a pretty good inclusive package that covers everything from that standpoint. Next one, what do the post-closing roles for sellers look like? Oh, good question. So I think I touched a little bit on this on that mistake number one. But the first, it kind of depends on what does the seller want as involvement. So most where they're selling and they want to go do something else, i.e., I'm going to go sail the world, I'm going to be a math teacher, whatever it is, and they've got some motivating factor that is going to get them out. Typically, it's about 6 months to a year, transition assistance. It's not full-time in any way, and they're done. They're out. Now, there are also sellers who don't particularly know exactly what they want to do. They think they'll still be around. They just don't want to have to run a business anymore. And those will typically fall under two buckets. Either they sell, they do the same consulting that we talked about, and then they stick around and have a rainmaker clause where if they bring new clients in the door, then they're able to get something for that, right? You give them a percentage of whatever new business they're able to bring in. The other option, the third option, is what we call a sell and be retained model. So basically, they sell the business, they relieve the ability of having to run it, right? You know, HR, adult daycare is probably the worst thing that most sellers have had to do, and they don't like doing it. So, and they don't want to negotiate leases, and they don't want to pay bills, and they don't want to have to do that stuff. But they're still interested, and maybe I can stick around and help service some clients, or I can provide some financial planning assistance or something. So a lot of those deals, what we'll see is the seller sticks around for 3 to 5 years on an employment contract. And under that employment contract, there's usually a trigger that says they can leave early if they want to. And there's usually a trigger in there that says, buyer could fire you if you do something stupid. And there's some type of salary that's negotiated in that 3 to 5 year window. So typically those deals look a little different. Cash down payment of some sort. Then the rest is put on a note. The note is deferred until after the employment period, so the buyer's not having to pay note and employment at the same time. And so basically the note is principal and interest at a future date, but it's interest only while there's a salary. So you get down payment, you get a salary plus interest only, and then it kicks in principal and interest after that point. Next question, does the turnkey deal support include the business valuation? It does not. So if you want a business valuation, we are a accredited appraisal business. So we've got the person that runs our valuation has a CPA license and a CVA. So we have to do set guidelines. So it's a little bit more work than I think you saw on there that our baseline is $1,400. So the turnkey does not include that. Not everybody needs it. Maybe they've agreed to a number across the board. There is a special so because of the standards we have to apply, there's a certain way we have to do valuations. But there is one where we remove all the benchmarking. It's super easy, and they just need a number for the lender. And if you've got a deal in place, you already know the price tag, and you need a valuation just to show the appraised value for the lender. The lender can then hire us through it, and it's cheaper that way. And then you'd actually have the closing costs go through that way. So it can go that. Okay. So Next question. What does a typical non-compete agreement look like to restrict the seller from contacting for soliciting acquired clients for any other type of financial services, i.e. fixed or insurance business versus securities? And then to what extent is your team typically involved as a mediator to negotiate the specifics of the deal? So mediator all the time. That's most of what I do on a regular basis. So I will typically talk to them about these particular issues or any potential thing that might pop up, whether they know it's coming or not. I will probably bring it up and say, let's talk about this and make sure you're on the same page. In terms of restrictive covenant agreements, I typically, on insurance-based business and securities, will see a very similar restrictive covenant agreement. I think that seems to be agnostic to what world you're coming from. Now, the caveats there is that every state's going to be a little bit different on what they're going to require. Any type of purchase and sale, you can usually get away with a non-compete, but it's usually, you can't stop somebody from making a living. So it has to be very narrowly defined in scope. And what that usually means is that there has to be some type of radius for a non-compete that around that particular office or the seller's office or the buyer's office. But that is usually not the one that people hang their hats on. So you've got a non-compete, you have a non-solicitation agreement, and then we have what we call a no-serve clause. And we can help you through that, but most will hang their hat on the no-serve clause piece of it. So first, non-compete, obviously can't stop somebody from making a living, so it's tough to enforce. Non-solicitation, hey, who called who and how do you prove it? Difficult. No-serve clause basically says, hey, you can start up next door, you can talk to the clients, you just cannot service any of the clients you sold me, right? And so at the end of the purchase agreement, we'd make a client list. Here's the names. You cannot service any of those, period. Done. In any capacity that is in that realm, whether it's insurance, whether it's securities, you can blanket statement it all. But so far that has actually held up pretty well because of the fact that it's narrowly defined in scope and it doesn't stop somebody from making a living. It just stops them from being able to service the client they sold you. So usually all three are in there, but those are all usually elements from it. And the no serve is usually about 10 years on most of the deals we do. So sometimes they negotiate shorter, but most of them will be for about 10 years. So I think that is the last of the questions here. So I just want to thank you for joining us. Appreciate you taking your time out of your day. I know time is valuable. If you have any other questions, please give us a call. The phone number's on the board there, 503-427-9910. We'd be happy to answer any questions you've got, especially if they're more like personal that you didn't want answered over the presentation here. But we are here and we're certainly willing to help. Thank you very much.